エッチね。
無理だね。ああ、間違いない。
It's been 1 year since I started MIA, so I wanted to share my experiences so far. I've made videos in the past about my first 6 months, but nobody needs to listen to that many uhs and ums and so's. And so I've done the cringy work of watching them back, and I'll try to summarize everything I went through and where I am now. When I made those first 6-month videos, the most common question I received was, what level were you before you started MIA? So before I talk about where I am now and what I've done since I started MIA, I'd like to just briefly explain what kind of level I was at. If you want to skip the part about my history learning Japanese, just have a look at the timestamps down below and skip to whichever part you're interested in listening to. In 2016, I moved to Tokyo. I lived and worked there for 7 months. I was then given the opportunity to work in my hometown Dublin for the company, and when I went back to my hometown, I'd had such a good time in Tokyo that I decided that I really wanted to learn Japanese. I really wanted to be able to talk to people and take part in the community and be tapped into that Japanese matrix that a lot of foreigners just never get into. When I was in Dublin, I already had Genki. I remember I bought Genki on one of my lunch breaks. I was in Shinjuku. I climbed up 7 flights of stairs in the Kinokuniya to the foreign book section. I bought my copy of Genki and I barely studied it. I studied it some days without regularity. I remember trying to read these very basic hiragana dialogues and just having terrible headaches trying to do it. It was so hard at the start. Then when I moved to Dublin, I had that textbook. So I went through, I finished that. I downloaded pre-made decks on Anki for N4, N5, and eventually N3 level vocab and grammar. I decided that I wanted to do the N3 test in July. I set that as a target for myself, but this was December, so basically I just crammed everything in a very short amount of time. I just grinded the SRS as much as I could. So I did that for 7 months. And then I took the test, I went to Shibuya, I sat down, I had a big sweater on, it was really hot, I was sat next to the window, I was dying sweating, and I sat down and did this test, and somehow I passed it. I don't know how I did it. Basically what I did was sit down and through the powers of deduction, mathematically try and understand what was in front of me. It was terrible. I had spent 7 months just grinding SRS and learning this vocab and grammar points in isolation. The cards were just kanji on the front, furigana, and English definition on the back. There were no sentences. I didn't use sentence cards. It was all just vocab and grammar points. After doing it, I thought I would be able to read like magazine articles or things like that and watch TV and understand it, but that didn't really happen. So natural Japanese just was inaccessible for me at this point. What I did after that was stop studying for the JLPT for a bit. I decided that what I would do is try and immerse somewhat, but unlike perhaps you did, I didn't Google a better way of doing things. I just bought some manga, I watched some TV, I watched some anime or shows on the internet without any structure. I would say I immersed about an hour a day at best, but I can't really say I was really focused. I was using like Japanese to English translations to try and understand what was going on. So I didn't even really know how to immerse. And then after a while, I started like grinding N2 decks and Anki, and I really hated that. I really didn't want to get back into that groove of studying that way. Then one night in March, I was with my friend drinking in Ueno on a bridge, and I remember I was going home and I got my train, I got on the train, and suddenly Matt's video, AJAT Timeline, popped up. I clicked on it and I listened to it. Everything he said in there was what I wanted to do. Basically, I knew everything he said made sense. If I wanted to reach my goals, this is what I'd have to do. From that point forward, I spent 1 month researching, watching all of Matt's videos. I read the AJAT table of contents, and then I got into it in May last year properly. I actually distinctly remember May last year. It's Golden Week in Japan, and Me and my friends went out drinking one night. We were out very, very late. The next day I was very hungover and I was sitting in my bath and I just thought, yeah, I'm gonna do it today. Today I have a week off after this. I'm gonna just get into it. To give you an idea of my level at that point, I remember trying to read a novel. It's called Kuro no Kage, I believe. It's a crime mystery novel. It's called The Black Lizard in English, I think. And I could not get past the first page. So novels were totally inaccessible to me. I couldn't read pages of manga and really understand the flow of the story or what was really happening. And when I watched TV, I thought I could understand the basic gist, but I know now that that's not the case. Basically, I would hear a few words and just make it up in my head. Really, I think that's what I was doing. So essentially at this point, listening to Japanese and reading Japanese was a mixture of grinding words and using those words in kind of a mathematical formula to try and guess my way to the meaning. Reading was not at all comfortable for me. Listening was not easy. I would very easily become lost. I just didn't reach the goals that I wanted to reach. Let's talk about what I did since I started MIA. First, I did RTK the traditional way, as it is in the book. I did 20 new cards a day, and towards the end I did 30 cards a day, as it states in the Age at Timeline video. I made my own stories as per the book. I didn't really do anything outside what everyone else did at the time. The only good thing was at the start I had a terrible card layout, and then Matt made his Anki card video for RTK and it was much better. It's much nicer. Originally, I'll try and show you the horrible stroke order font we had to use at the time, and then it looks much nicer nowadays. I did that for, I believe, 4.5 months it took me to finish, because there were some days I didn't add cards. If I was to give some advice to anyone who wants to do RTK, it would just be do it at like 15 a day. Take your time, don't rush. At this time I was also immersing as much as I could, but I wasn't tracking how much immersion I was doing. I would say it was 3 hours a day or 4 hours a day immersion. Just active listening, and on top of that, passive listening whenever I could. Since then, I got quite busy at the start of this year, and my RTK reps got away from me, became really high. So what I did was I just reset my deck, and I'm now currently going through it again. However, doing RTK again is not the same, because I still do have the ability to remember a lot of those characters. I can write a lot of those characters even though they're coming up as new cards. I should explain what I did was I exported my deck without the scheduling information, and I deleted it and then I re-imported it, so it's adding new cards randomly, and I'm just doing them as they come up. Because I lived in Japan and I'm going to go back to Japan in a year, I think, handwriting is really important to me, so I just want to maintain that ability. So I'm redoing RTK at a pace of 15 new cards a day. Let's talk about how much time I was spending on active immersion. So like I said, when I was doing RTK, I think it was about 3 to 4 hours every day active immersion, and the rest of the time passive immersion. When I started doing the bilingual sentence cards, I started monitoring my time spent immersing more. I believe at that time it was also around 3 hours every day, and I decided that I needed to up my active immersion because that's the type of immersion that will benefit you the most. And so I got a tracker, which I do recommend using. It's called A Tracker. It's just a basic timer. You can set different tasks on it, and I would time how much time I spent every day properly actively immersing. Now, I do want to talk about properly actively immersing, because as you know, in Matt's video, he talked about meditation and how important it is, and I do think it's really important because you can easily become convinced that you're doing like 8 hours of active immersion a day, and it's absolutely not true. What's happening is you're just zoning out, you're looking at your phone, you're thinking about other things, you're thinking about what you're going to have for lunch, and so for that you absolutely have to get into meditation. So that's why I recommend using a tracker and being like strict about how much active immersion you're actually doing, because what you can end up doing is, you know, you say you're going for a run, you run down to the shop, you walk around the shop, you buy some things, you go out, you run down some more, you go have a coffee, you run, you come back to your house, and then you say you did a run for 4 hours when in reality you did a run for 30 minutes. You know, that's really what tends tends to happen. And so using a tracker and being strict about when you're actually focusing on a show and when you're actually paying attention 100% is important, I think. When I made the monolingual transition, I decided I wanted to up my active immersion to 5 hours a day, and I used this tracker to work out a routine that I could achieve that. 5 hours a day is a bit of an arbitrary number, but based on how much time I had in the day, even on my working days, I figured I could fit it in, and that's what I aimed for. I was doing 3 hours of active listening at the start while I was doing RTK. At around the 5-6 month mark, I upped my active listening to 5 hours a day. Nowadays, I'm doing 4 hours of active listening a day and 1 to 2 hours of active reading a day. It's very difficult to assess what level of comprehension you have in terms of listening because it depends on the subject. I would say any regular everyday anime I can understand a high level. I mean, like, I would say 99% on most of them. Science fiction, which I watch a lot, is more difficult, and it is dependent on the series. For example, something I would be more familiar with, like Cowboy Bebop or Ghost in the Shell, is not too difficult for me, although I do get lost in some of the details. Psycho Pass, for example, stumped me. That one I couldn't follow very well. There's another movie, Genocidal Organ, which I haven't watched in months, but it stumped me. Because I'm doing reading recently, I feel like my vocabulary, my general comprehension has improved. And so I've returned to some movies after a month or 2 months and actually been able to understand a lot more. So for example, I was watching Evangelion 333 recently. And I remember the first time I watched it, which I think was 3 or 4 months ago, there's a conversation Kaoru and Shinji are having, and afterwards Shinji and Fuyutsuki have a conversation. I couldn't understand that at the start, first time I watched it, but I watched it this month and I understood all of it. So my general comprehension is being improved also by reading in more difficult conversations, but I still have a lot of things to learn and fill in gaps with, especially vocabulary. I mean, with science fiction, it really is vocabulary more so than grammar or anything like that. They're very specific terms that are used in some situations. So in summary, daily conversations such as in Terrace House or YouTube videos are in the 90% range, as well as everyday anime, but more difficult things such as very complicated movies or science fiction is still a work in progress, but I can understand most of it, most of the story points, just some terms and some of the nuance is lost on me. I want to talk about meditation because I think it's really important if you want to get the most out of active listening. Because you're watching a movie or watching a TV show, it's playing at its own pace and you really have to focus on it to get everything out of it. That's an ability that I didn't have. I'm sure anyone who hasn't meditated doesn't have the ability to sit down for an hour and really just focus as much as possible on that without your mind wandering, you checking your phone, you doing things like that. About a few months ago, I decided to read Kuladasa's manual. Although I bought it a long time ago, I barely read a bit of it and I started meditating and I didn't have a good practice. 4 months ago, I started again. I took 20 minutes out of my day to start reading the book, and then 40 minutes out of my day after reading the book to practice meditating. And doing that has made a huge difference to my ability to focus while doing active listening. It's made a huge difference to my listening ability. If you really want to get the most out of your active immersion, I think it's really necessary because, like I said before, you can be thinking you're immersing for a long time when in reality you're not focusing as much as you thought you were. This really made a big difference to me. I would really recommend reading the book at least to stage 4 and doing a 40-minute meditation, 30-minute meditation, whatever you can do. Don't do it too low, like 5 minutes, 10 minutes. I really don't think that counts. I do think it has to be that longer period of time for you to really get into it, because you're sitting down for 30, 40 minutes and watching TV shows. So it makes sense to do it for a longer time, to train yourself to be able to focus for that amount of time. I also used a guided meditation video that Kuladasa himself posted, which I'll link under this video, which helps you a lot. I think you should read the book, and you should also do the guided meditation, get used to it, and then you can do it by yourself for 30 minutes or 40 minutes every day. It will make a huge difference to how much you're getting out of your active immersion. I know it's made a huge difference to my focus and to my listening ability. For reading, I've read 4 books so far this year, and before that I dabbled in some manga and in some light novels. I never finished a light novel because I found it quite difficult to read, because it was kind of boring to me. I wasn't really interested much in the stories, unfortunately. I read some manga, including the whole One Punch Man series. I read a little bit of the Ghost in the Shell series, although that's really hard. That's a real term and vocabulary minefield. I wouldn't recommend going through that. For novels, I've read Shigoto wa Tanoshii Kane and Norue no Mori, which are full-on novels, full-sized novels. And I've read 2 novellas, I guess. They're about 60, 70 pages each. One is Hebi ni Kiyasu. The other one is Kuseki. Those were difficult. The first one I read was Kuseki, which was a police novel, and because I was reading a little bit before in light novels, I started a bit to get used to it. But when you start reading, it's really difficult because you are the pace of the story. You are pushing the pace on. If you are slow at reading, if you're out of practice and you're just starting to read, it can be really difficult to get into the rhythm of reading. It can feel like you're really treading through mud or something like that. It's very, very difficult to give it yourself to sit down for an hour and do it, because it just feels horrible. You're just staring into the face of the fact that you're not so good at this. But the only advice I can give for that is just keep going, keep doing it, keep making sentence cards. What I came to do was I would highlight I+1 sentences on my Kindle, and I would bookmark where I finished reading, and then I would choose one I+1 sentence on the page and make 5 sentence cards a day for sentences in my novel that I was reading. Usually I found that the first chapter was the most difficult, and then after that the author tends to use the same phrases and the same words again and again, and it becomes easier to read. So I wouldn't say judge the difficulty of a novel by the first chapter. Usually you get used to it, but I know it is very difficult to get into reading novels because it just feels horrible. Like when you're watching something, active listening, you are just sitting back and it's dictating the pace, but when you're reading, you have to dictate the pace, and if you're not good at reading, the pace is really slow. And yeah, it's very, very difficult. I treated reading basically the way I would treat reading in English, which is I wouldn't read over things too many times. I wouldn't go back and read things much at all. If I felt like I could understand it and imagine it in my head, I would continue on. I think reading books like that, not manga, is really effective because you are calling your imagination into play. And you're reading these words and you're projecting it in your imagination, and it's a really strong way to solidify these words and improve your reading. My reading's gotten much better in the last 4 months. I know the first novella I read took me a while, and then I read Shigoto wa Tanoshii Kane, and that improved quite a lot. Then I read Norue no Mori, and I think that book especially, I really got much better at reading by the end of that. I was really used to creating a pace and reading at a pace and imagining what's happening in my head, and it just became much more fluid. And the last novella I read was quite easy for me to read, and now I'm on to my 3rd full novel. It's not to say that I read through these novels and I know every word. That's not what I'm saying at all. There's obviously new words on pretty much every page, but it's very easy for me to guess what those mean from the context. I can imagine everything that's happening in the story. I can see it in my imagination, in my mind's eye. It's just there are some words, some terms I'm not familiar with, and I make sentence cards for them. So I'm still making like 5 sentence cards a day for novels, and that's really it. My reading's gotten much, much better just from doing an hour every day for the last 4 or 5 months. I am increasing it now because I'm not able to read really the news. The news is kind of like a different sphere. For the time being, I'm going to continue reading novels. Probably I'm going to read another 2 or 3 more novels and then move on to focusing on news articles, because news articles are another thing. I think it's important to kind of master one sphere, in this case novels, and then move on to another sphere, for example the news, because you can take that base that you've gained from novels and apply it to the news. It's no different. It's just the same as when I started reading novels. I just need to apply myself an hour every day to reading news articles, and eventually I'll be able to do it. I do have a Japanese Twitter account, which I just followed the Japanese news and some Japanese Twitter people on it. It's a good way to slowly get into that. Nowadays I can read Twitter pretty well, and it's very good for I+1 sentences. It's like just at my level of news. So I'm doing that for the time being, but soon, in a few months, I do want to spend some time just focusing on being able to really understand news articles and newspapers. So I've made a bunch of sentence cards. So I have over 2,000 sentence cards. About 400, 500 of those are dictionary branches. The rest of them are monolingual sentence cards. I've become much more comfortable with using the monolingual dictionary, although sometimes in the definitions there are words I don't know. Usually there aren't, so even when I have days where I have to add words that are dictionary branches nowadays, they're usually quite rare words, I would say, not common words. So for every 10 cards I add, I'd say I have 1, maybe 2 dictionary branches that I add, but to be honest, I don't think I actually need. You know, I can totally understand the definition without one word in the explanation. For active listening, I'm now able to watch TV shows, YouTube, maybe everyday anime with about 90% comprehension, I would say, and that's being quite strict. Some things are more difficult. Some science fiction is more difficult. Not all of it, but some of it is more difficult. And the news, for example, is difficult, but that's because there's just some vocabulary I don't know, and I'm not used to watching the news. I don't watch it much, so I need to spend more time on that kind of content in the future. Reading, I'm able to read novels. I really enjoy novels. I'm going through my 5th novel right now. But I do also need to just add more vocabulary. It is that thing. It's not 100% comprehension. It's even novels. It would be a lot of new vocabulary in every novel I'm reading, so that's just something I need to continue doing. And then I also need to work on reading the news. I can read Twitter quite well nowadays, Japanese Twitter, but I need to work on reading actual articles. So that's what I'm going to focus on as well in the future. And right now I'm kind of working on pitch accent. So I've got a piece of paper with the most common pitch accent words from different pitch accent patterns, and then when I'm listening, I'm paying attention to those words and trying to catch the pitch accent, and that's really helping my listening for pitch accent. And this year, maybe in 2 months, I think I'm planning to spend a month just really focusing on pitch accent and pitch accent theory and getting that down. And then perhaps in the later half of this year, or later half of my 2nd year studying this way, I'm gonna get into outputting, so get into preparing for outputting, so practicing shadowing and things like that. So yeah, if you made it all the way to the end, thank you very much for watching. To be honest, it was probably a really big waste of your time watching it this long. Sorry for rambling throughout the whole thing, but yeah, hopefully someone got some useful information out of this. By the way, on the video, if you were watching the footage, that's in Inokashira Koen in Kichijoji in Tokyo, and it's a really nice place. And if you're ever there for cherry blossom season, if you're ever there anytime, definitely go visit it. It's a really great place. I love it so much. I want to go back soon. And yeah, that's really it. Thank you very much, and see you sometime. I don't know if it'll be in 6 months. I don't know if I'll do another video in a year. Let's see. But I'll definitely be studying then. Don't worry. Okay, so yeah, thank you very much. See you.
なんておかしいよなこれ。それね、名誉毀損っていうんですよ。そういうなんでさ、そういうことをしちゃうのかな。信じられないよ。ちょっとさ、人をこうバカにするのもいい加減にしろよ。おい、お前さ、大丈夫か、大丈夫かな。JR の切符が結構思ったよりやりすぎちゃったんですけど、これもう悲しいです。 僕はこうやって毎日毎日動画を一生懸命撮って、そのお金でね、